Welcome to our first episode of the series on Trevor Noah's memoir, Born a Crime. Today's episode, we're going to focus on some pre-reading information, so you know all the key details before you delve into the text. So just to give you a bit of an overview on what we're looking at today, we'll start by looking at some context detail. We'll touch on the plot, some character and theme information. We'll explore some of the text construction, so the linguistic, stylistic and structural features of this particular text, and also look into a little bit about what influenced his decision to write the book and his authorial intent. Let's start with some basic information, and this text was first published in 2016. It's a memoir written by Trevor Noah. He's a South African-born man who is based in the United States, and you might know him from The Daily Show. This memoir focuses on his formative years, and he describes it of a coming-of-age journey. In fact, he calls it him and his mother's coming-of-age journey. As I mentioned, it details his childhood experiences on the outskirts of Johannesburg, and it balances humour with the severity of division and oppression in post-apartheid South Africa. Speaking of South Africa, I'll try and run through briefly some historical details on what we now know as the Republic of South Africa. So in the 4th century, the Bantu tribes from the north migrated south, joining several other indigenous groups in what we would now call or refer to as South Africa. In the 1950s, the Dutch established a settlement near Cape Town, which is called, Cape Colony. And this would start migration from not just the Netherlands, but also from German and French migrants, and they're known as Afrikaners. Between 1795 and 1806, the British seized the settlement of Cape Colony before returning it to the Dutch in the early 19th century, only for that then to be ceded back to the British Empire. Now, the Zulu Empire is formed in the 1810s, and you can see on the map on the right-hand side a place called Zululand. Between the 1860s and 1880s, diamonds and gold are discovered in several regions, which, as you can imagine, led to more migration. You'll notice on the map here there are several different settlements or colonies. Several were part of the British Empire. Others were Dutch, some were from native tribes as well. So there was a real mix of colonies in this particular area, all obviously wanting access to things like diamond and gold and other minerals. In 1879, there was a British invasion of Zululand, who managed to hold them out, except there was a second advance where the British forces succeeded. Now we've got these two Boer Wars now, which happened in 1880 and 1889. Now, the British at this time wanted to unite all the different colonies together, but the Afrikaans-speaking farmers wanted to maintain independence, and the Afrikaans-speaking farmers are known as Boers. So there were two wars, and it finished in the second one in 1889 with a win to the British Empire. In 1910, finally, there was a union of South Africa, and in 1934, South Africa declared independence from the British Empire. Following World War II in 1948, apartheid policies implemented created deeper division in South Africa, and that did not end until 1994, and after it ended, Nelson Mandela was voted in as president. He, of course, was sent to jail for around 25 years as well during apartheid. So hopefully that gives you a relatively brief run through of some major points in South African history that will be relevant to this particular text. But once again, there's a lot more information out there if you want to undertake some further research. Speaking of apartheid, I'll run through it once again. I'm going to be going through this relatively quickly, but it is a term used to describe the legal policy that governed interactions between white and black persons in South Africa. And that's a language that I'll be using, I should say. White, black, coloured, Indian, these are terms that are used in the text. Trevor Noah says himself that apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance with laws designed to keep black people under total control. Now, this resulted in significant division and inequality. So rights that had to do with education, with voting, with land ownership, these had a significant impact, with poverty being quite rife for the black population. And it should be noted they made up around 80% of the population and still do today in South Africa. Now, apartheid ended in 1994 when these laws were abolished. However, as Trevor Noah writes on page 4, that apartheid fell, Mandela walked free, and black South Africa went to war with itself, because there are many different ethnic groups that form that sort of 80% of the South African population. I want to look now at the different ethnic groups. Trevor Noah writes himself on page 65 that despite the fact that black people made up over 80% of South Africa's population, the territory allocated for the homelands was about 13% of the country's land. There was no running water, no electricity, and people lived in huts. There was significant segregation. Noah provides detail around the different non-white ethnic groups in South Africa and explores the complex relationships between them, noting that apartheid was not just a division between two groups. That's really important for us to know. And he raised that previously when he said that black people went to war with themselves in terms of the different ethnic groups. And there was a particularly strong tension between the Zulu and Xhosa people, which is underscored in chapter 1 when he and his mother have a run-in. Now, traditionally, the terms white, black, coloured and Indian were used to describe these groups, and that's what's mentioned and referenced in the text, with each having their own customs, laws and values. And obviously, if you were white, you had much more privilege and many more rights than those who weren't. Now, Noah's mother is Xhosa and his dad was Swiss, and we'll come on to that point a little bit later on in this video. It's a really pertinent and important point. So I wanted to run through the setting, and most of the text takes place in Soweto, which is on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Almost 99% of the population in Soweto is black. Trevor Noah was born in 1984, so most of this text is set in the 1990s. We know, of course, that apartheid ended in 1994 when Noah wasn't quite a teenager yet, 10 or 11 years old. There are high crime rates and levels of police brutality. And a quote from page 42, all of our neighbours had driveways, some with fancy iron cast gates. None of them had cars either. The story of Soweto is a story of driveways. It's a hopeful place. So the text really is about two characters, Trevor and his mother, as he sort of referenced himself. It is him and his mother's coming of age journey. Now, Trevor is the narrator. He is coloured. He's raised by his mother, who provides and supports for him, and he doesn't really have much to do with his father, who is Swiss. He struggles to fit in throughout his childhood and find a sense of belonging due to his status as being coloured. But he does speak many languages and he is educated, and this provides him with opportunities. And he uses language really well in terms of being able to fit in, to escape danger as well. His mother, Patricia, is a sole provider, and she really does provide tough love for Trevor, but is a significant influence on him and continually supports him. She goes against the expectations at the time. She lives in Johannesburg when black people weren't allowed to. She has a child with someone who's Swiss. That was illegal at the time. There's some great quotes from Trevor. He says she had a level of fearlessness, that she was a rebel, and that she was a survivor. She experiences many hardships, including poverty, racism, sexism, domestic abuse, violence, and isolation, but she really is heroic. And Trevor himself notes that when he wrote this text in one of his interviews, that she was a real hero of the text, which surprised him because he thought he would naturally be that. But he admits, no, my mother is a true hero in this text. There's two other characters I'll touch on briefly. We've got Abel, who is Patricia's husband, and has a son, Andrew, with Patricia, who's much younger than Trevor. He's violent, he's an alcoholic, and he's extremely abusive, and both Patricia and Trevor suffer at his hands. There's a metaphor Trevor uses to describe him. It's one of a cobra, and it's one that I'll definitely be using in my essays. His father is Robert. As I said, he's Swiss, but he's unable to be a significant part of Trevor's life because it is literally a crime for someone who's white and someone who's black to have a child. Now, he eventually does reunite with his son much later on, and he does keep a close eye on Trevor Noah and his career. Robert features slightly on, I guess, part 1, whereas Abel is much more prominent in part 2 and part 3. Now, these aren't the only 4 characters in the texts. Plenty of Trevor's friends and love interests appear throughout as well. And there's some of these that you can touch upon, I'm sure, in your essays, particularly if there's ones that resonate with you that you'll be able to pick out. And we might look at those in some later episodes. I've jotted down about 12 key themes or ideas here. Once again, I always say this, these aren't separate ideas, they're interconnected together, and it's by no means an exhaustive list of themes and ideas that Trevor Noah explores throughout the text. There are so many different aspects and ideas that he has messages about, which he wants to send to the audience. I've picked out these ones though, racism, segregation, outcasts and outsiders, identity and belonging, isolation, family and friendship, conflict, education and language, growing up, power and the abuse of power, love and violence. So when you're reading the text a couple of times, there might be ideas around these themes that might come up a fair bit as you're reading through it for a second or perhaps even a third time. So when we're analysing a text, we're not just simply looking at the plot, we're looking also about how this plot unfolds and how the events unfold and how they're written. In your essays, you're able to bring in context information, linguistic, stylistic and structural features, symbols and motifs and authorial intent as a way to showcase to the examiner and the marker that you're looking much deeper into the text and not just focusing on, I guess, the basics, the surface level. The title is really important. It's called Born a Crime, and there's a quote from chapter 2 which explains this. The doctors took her up to the delivery room. This is Trevor's mother, Patricia, cut open her belly and reached in and pulled out a half-white, half-black child who violated a number of laws, statutes and regulations. I was born a crime. Metaphorically, he's literally a criminal. He is a crime. What you'll also note is that this text starts literally with the act that, I guess, illegalizes this birth. And that's factual information, and that's the way the text opens straight away. So it's something, again, that you might want to look at because it's something that's unique about this text is the way it opens with that particular crimes act. Let's move on to the literary features. It is a memoir to an extent, so it's Trevor telling stories from his childhood, and he links them all up together, and their anecdotes are often filled with dialogue. Now, these aren't factually correct or accurate, but they're used to provide insight into the characters and provide first-hand insight into experiences with things like poverty, violence, and racism. There are plenty of symbols and motifs throughout the text. He labels himself a chameleon. Language and words, guns, cars and driveways, animals. There's so many different symbols that appear throughout, and you might want to, as again, when you read it a second or third time, pick up on some of these. The sentence length is something as well that you might want to analyze too. We have long sentences filled with many clauses to add particular detail to events and experiences, and short sentences for emphasis as well. And again, when you read it a second or third time, these are things you might want to pick up on. In terms of style and structure, this is the first person narrative perspective from Trevor's point of view, but he does write it in past tense. He's reflecting on his childhood. It's a non-linear structure as well, so it's not exactly chronological. There are shifts in time. We do have flashbacks, but also fast forwards to his future when he talks about events that happened to him later on in his life. What these do, I guess, is showcase how the past has influenced Trevor Noah, but also his family as well. So how the past impacts the future and the present as well. It's in 3 parts as well. So part 1 details his birth and early years. This is probably a bit more linear. Part 2 revolves around his early teenage years and his education, while part 3 focuses on his later teenage years and his growing independence. Something that's quite unique to this text as well is the historical detail. So, prior to each chapter, Noah provides historical context and social commentary, informing the reader about South Africa's history and its significance to his life and journey. The reason he does this first is because he does want to inform the audience and provide them with insight into South African history. But what it also does is it highlights the impact that policies can have on a human level, what governments and authorities can do and what they implement, the laws they implement, how they can impact someone on a human level. Probably the main thing that you want to pick up on as well is the humour and the explicit language that comes in throughout this text. And Noah juxtaposes serious events and emotions with a lot of humour. The reason he uses humour, well, there's a lot of reasons why he uses humour. I guess one could be he wants to reflect the innocence and fun of childhood. It also shows the connection between him and his mother, and you can definitely look at the last moments of chapter 1 as well at the end of, I think it's the bottom of page 7, where after a really traumatic and hard event, they both end up laughing. It's also used, I guess, a bit as a coping mechanism and a way to overcome and deal with trauma, but it also connects to his future career as a comedian as well, and shows how humour played a significant role throughout his whole life. It's also something that you'll see if you read the audiobook, and that's something I would definitely recommend you to do, is to listen to the audiobook because it's fantastic. One of the last things I wanted to touch upon today is authorial intent, and I think this is really important to include the reasons why Trevor Noah wrote this text in your analysis when you start writing essays. And I've got 3 quotations here from interviews that he's done. He's done a lot of interviews, and in fact, I've popped links to a number of those interviews in the show notes if you want to have a look at those when you've got the time. The first one says, "I think sometimes it's nice to have perspective on these issues, just so that you understand that it's not a unique problem that one country deals with, but rather an idea that society as a whole deals with across borders." He's talking here particularly about the ramifications of racism and racist laws. And this is in the context of the United States, obviously, where he now lives and works, and how what happens in South Africa does actually relate to what's happening in America still today. The second quotation is, "I always thought that I was going to be the hero of my own journey, but once I was done writing the book, I was like, oh no, I'm just a lucky sidekick and got to come along for the ride." And this is where I think it's a great quote in terms of his mother, how she is the real hero of the story, and how it's not just a memoir about his life, but about her life as well, and the significant sacrifice that she makes for him. And the last one, he says and invites the audience to come into my world, live in South Africa for a bit, grow up as a mixed race child, learn what it's like to be an outsider in a world that is defined by only colour and race. Once again, he wants to inform and get the audience to empathise with what life was like for him, about being an outsider, about being poor, about growing up in South Africa, which was a really divided society. And Trevor Noah does aim to provide an authentic insight into his childhood in South Africa and his experiences with poverty, with cultural diversity, with education, with love, with friends and family and oppression. He celebrates outsiders who overcome adversity, who value love and their close relationships, while also condemning a world which values an individual and is based on solely their colour. So to finish today, I really would encourage you to conduct some further research on the social, cultural and historical context of this novel, and look into South Africa particularly as a country and its history. Look into Trevor Noah's career since his adolescence as well. It's really important, I think, to have a look at some of his stand-up comedy. It's really funny, but also it tells us a little bit more about his character. Definitely purchase and listen to the audiobook. Trevor Noah is the narrator himself, and it just provides that more authentic experience into his childhood. Read the novel once for understanding, and a second time to highlight the key moments and analyse themes and construction, and if you have time, obviously, a third and fourth time. Now, the first time I read this novel, it was through the audiobook, and the second time I read it without it, and that's when I did a lot of my annotations. And lastly, start building a quotation bank as soon as possible. Look at quotations that relate to a number of different themes and ideas, and from that, look for the quotations that are really, I guess, flexible and adaptable, including ones that involve literary features and structural features as well. We'll be having a number of episodes this season on Born a Crime, so I'm hoping you'll be able to join me throughout the year as we go through these. We'll have a playlist for Born a Crime, and I'm looking forward to working with you and seeing you next time on the 6Ps podcast.